Hello, my name is Jose, and I will be doing question 2, which is what did you learn about selective incorporation? Discuss McDonald versus Chicago in this regard. Selective incorporation is an ongoing process of effectively implementing or upholding the Constitution and the Bill of Rights in state law and state constitutions. Now, this sort of thing happens because as we are a federalist government, a federalist state, each state has its liberties and each state has the liberty and freedom to have its state laws and constitutions, which is what directly guides a judge of that state, right? However, there's also this understanding that there's this greater law of the land, which is the U.S. Constitution and those federal laws. So selective incorporation seeks to merge those two. It seeks to sort of right where any state has not upheld the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. An easy way of understanding this is by starting at a sort of state level case in which a citizen is denied or its rights, its civil liberties, and is then stripped of them. If he then makes an appeal to the Supreme Court, they can look over the case and consider whether or not there are rights and liberties that are being discarded and overlooked, and it becomes their responsibility to say whether or not the state needs to incorporate the rights that are set out in the Bill of Rights. And we can follow this more directly when we look at a case which is McDonald's versus Chicago. That's what we'll be looking at today. To begin looking at this case, though, I want to define two terms very quickly. First is civil liberties. The second is civil rights. Although these two terms are very interrelated and they tend to have a lot of interchangeability in the popular discourse, they are two different things, two different concepts. Civil liberties refers to the limitations that a government has, and this is intended to protect the rights of its citizens, whereas civil rights is a guarantee that a government will treat its citizens equally and will make decisions based off merit rather than race, gender, or any other sort of personal characteristic. So where civil liberties address the government's limitations, civil rights addresses the government's guarantees to its citizens, right? So when we think about this case then, and when we think about this case, which is McDonald versus the city of Chicago, and also when we think about selective incorporation, they work mostly on the civil liberties. They work mostly on seeing if the government has exceeded its power and has then stripped its citizens of any of its liberties. And in this case, McDonald versus Chicago, the liberty in question is the right to bear arms, which is a very controversial topic, especially nowadays. But this case itself brings up sort of the intricacies of how the government works, but also of what it means to have these liberties and how we uphold these liberties as a nation. So looking at McDonald versus the city of Chicago, the main complaint is that the city of Chicago has established laws that ban handheld guns in homes. Now this, according to McDonald, left its citizens vulnerable. It left them scared, and this is infringing upon the Second Amendment, right, which is the right to bear arms. So when he brings this up to the Supreme Court, what they have to do is essentially two things, right? They have to consider the context of the case itself, but they also have to consider precedent, and they have to consider what is called a sort of connection to the national motto or deep rootedness of the nation. I guess I can word that better. They consider two things. They consider the context and precedent, but they also consider whether or not the right that is being infringed upon is related to a truly American ideal and tradition. So when you looked at McDonald versus the city of Chicago, we see a few things. The argument that holds the most weight on the part of McDonald is that there is this right of self-defense, and this right is a right that is it is an absolute right. There is no going around it, and it has been recognized from ancient times until now, right? If we look at laws, there is this right to defend yourself in a case in which you are in danger. And considering that, then, in the context of the case that is being made, the judges came to a conclusion that there was a case to be made. And so the second thing that they then had to decide was whether there was precedence. And if you look through that court case, there are a lot of precedents that are set out. And this is then intertangled with that second part that they have to consider, which is whether or not this is deeply a case of American ideals and whether or not it is deeply entangled with American tradition. So when they consider this case, to see if they should incorporate the Bill of Rights into this state law, what they're really considering is what the case says as such. Pardon me. The court must decide whether that right is fundamental to the nation's scheme of ordered liberty. And in a similar context, in a related one, whether it is deeply rooted in this nation's history and tradition. So when they consider if the right to bear arms or the right to have a handheld gun in the home as a part of the nation's scheme, as a fundamental right to liberty, as a part of a deeply rooted nation's history and tradition, they came to the conclusion that yes, and especially when we consider the context of how this nation came to be, its origins, there is more than enough to come to the conclusion that there are civil liberties that are being ignored. And so the Supreme Court then made the decision that they are supposed to, or that, sorry, the Supreme Court then made the decision that he was in the right, that the city of Chicago had to uphold this civil liberty of owning handheld guns as a part of self-defense, as a absolute right. And that is a way of understanding selective incorporation. For the most part, it becomes the duty and the obligation of the Supreme Court to regulate whether or not liberties are being upheld in state constitutions. And if they're not, then they have the opportunity to consider with the context and with the precedent to see if it's all part of a deeply American tradition, a deeply American ideal, a deeply fundamental right that adds to the nation's understanding of liberty. And in this case, it did, right? So McDonald got to repeal the law in Chicago, and that's how it works, right? It works because it tries to bridge these sort of sometimes opposing state laws and constitutional laws.